So what is consensus? So consensus is at the heart of how blockchains work in the first place. So you might have to ask yourself, what makes a blockchain even possible? How can you have this public worldwide computer where you have all the users, data, and programs running on computers that anybody can download the software, anybody can download the information? What makes that secure? How come somebody can't tamper with it and change the balance? Why can you trust that all the data on the public ledger is actually accurate and secure? Well, that's exactly what consensus is all about. And so essentially to reach consensus, we have these two problems. In order to come to an agreement, we need to make sure that we are sharing data securely, all right, that data is actually can't be changed, it can't be tampered with, and then there's no discrepancies, that, the copy of the information that I have on my computer is the exact same copy as the information you have on your computer. So for example, if I have, 10 Bitcoin in my wallet and my computer says I have Bitcoin, but your computer says I have 9 Bitcoin, well, that's a problem. We need both of our computers to each say that I have 10 Bitcoin and you have 10 Bitcoin, and that all the transactions are up to date, they're secure, they can't be tampered with, and that there are no discrepancies. And that's exactly what consensus with blockchains is all about. So this problem is classically illustrated in computer science terms as the Byzantine generals problem. So that goes something like this. You have several generals, at least 3 in this situation, probably a lot more, who are surrounding a city, and their goal is to attack this city. They all want to attack it and achieve the same outcome, okay? And so if they attack and they are victorious, then the goal is met, all right? If not, then they have failed. Now, the generals have a conflict here, though, because while they want to attack the city, they could just retreat and live to see another day and not have to worry about any risk associated with that violence. And the problem is that the only way that they're actually going to make the city fall is if they all coordinate together to attack in order to do that. And, for example, if one general doesn't attack and the other 2 do, then they're just going to get slaughtered. They need everybody to coordinate together in order to successfully get what they want. And this is the part of the problem that illustrates what we're trying to do with blockchains when we're reaching consensus, is that you have to have all these different parties communicate with one another to agree upon a common goal. And so to further illustrate this problem and how it pertains to blockchain, in this case, the generals can only communicate with one another via horse messenger, okay? And so you can see, General 1 talking to General 2, so they're going to attack. General 2 talking to General 1, so they're going to attack, back and forth. And they have to accurately communicate their intent in order to achieve their common goal, which is for everyone to, attack the city. And you see that if there's any weak link here, if, one general talks to General 3 and says retreat while General 3 intends to attack, then the whole thing falls. So this is the Byzantine generals problem illustrated, and that's the exact problem that blockchains intend to solve with their consensus mechanisms. So let's talk about how those work. So what is a consensus protocol? Well, let's break that down. So what does the word consensus mean? Well, it essentially just means agreement. All right. So what is a consensus protocol? Well, it's the software that allows each node in the network to come to an agreement. Each blockchain has a unique way of doing this. In other words, each blockchain has a unique consensus protocol. We'll talk about some of the main ones here in a second, but they all basically do the same thing, which is whenever somebody goes to use the blockchain, they connect with their wallet and they create a transaction. Then that transaction gets broadcast to a node, which is one of the computers that makes up the blockchain. All right. Again, there's a peer-to-peer network of nodes that all talk to one another. Each node gets all the data, the programs, any user information is stored on each of these nodes. And so whenever a transaction is added to the blockchain, then each of these nodes has to come into agreement that the newly added transaction is valid and can therefore be added to the blockchain, and that transaction is valid and trustworthy. So the process by which these nodes come to this agreement about the validity of transactions and therefore the state of the new blockchain after transaction is submitted is how they achieve consensus. And so that's what each blockchain's consensus protocol is, the protocol by which they've decided that transactions are valid and can get included in the chain. Or the consensus algorithm is another way of saying that. You might have heard of consensus algorithms. It's basically the same thing. So some popular examples of consensus protocols are proof of work. This was the very first consensus mechanism proposed by the Bitcoin blockchain, which Bitcoin still runs off of today. It's also the very first consensus protocol for Ethereum before it switched to proof of stake. All right. Which is the next one, proof of stake, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Okay, this is a really popular one for newer blockchains, especially smart contract platforms. And there's also delegated proof of stake, which is a variant of proof of stake. We'll show a diagram of that here in a second. And a whole lot more. You know, there's dozens and dozens of consensus protocols. Some are more popular than others, but these are some of the top 3, and I'm going to explain how they work right now. So let's go over proof of work. And let's revisit a diagram from a previous section where we talk about the life cycle of a transaction. Basically, someone connects their wallet, they submit to the network, and whenever they submit to the network, essentially a miner is a person who validates that transaction and includes it on the chain. That's part of the consensus mechanism or consensus protocol, consensus algorithm, however you want to say it. And what they're doing is following the proof of work protocol. So how does it work? So some of the nodes on the network, all right, are also miners. Okay, so this diagram is not perfect because really these miners should be overlaid on top of these nodes, and not all nodes are mining nodes, but all miners are nodes. So these miners are responsible for running the network and including new transactions into the blockchain, and they have to make it secure. So they pay a lot of money to run hardware, okay, and they're financially incentivized to do this because the blockchain pays them to do it. They get a reward whenever they successfully mine a block and include it into the chain. So they do this through the process of proof of work. So what does that mean? Well, essentially what happens is whenever a new block is proposed, the blockchain itself, the actual software, generates something called a nonce. Okay, this is basically a secret number, and it's like a puzzle where all the miners on the network who want to mine a block, they use their computational resources to compete with one another to try to guess what this number is, or a range of solutions that are close enough to this number to provide a valid answer. Okay, and so they essentially do this through trial and error. Okay, guessing a bunch of different numbers. That's what their computers do. They're just guessing all the time. And as soon as they find a valid, match to this question or this nonce, okay, then the miner that does that first gets rewarded, and then they get to take all the data and get the valid block and put it into the blockchain. And whenever they do that, they receive the block reward or the new cryptocurrency that's created by the blockchain as a financial incentive for doing this, okay? And so that's what the proof of work is. They prove the work that they guessed this question correctly. And whenever they prove that, they get that reward. And so here's where the financial incentives come into play. You want to act honestly in this case because you want to get paid to do that. All right. There would be a bad incentive to try to add bad data because you would never guess this correctly and you would not be able to achieve consensus. And so that's part of the consensus is whenever they submit their, answer here, then all the other mining nodes and all the other nodes in the network essentially agree that their answer is valid and that they are for sure the winner. So there's no central entity involved. Essentially, all the software is deterministic and saying, yes, we know how to prove a valid answer and who got it first. And so and whenever that happens, it's broadcast through all the nodes in the network. They say, yes, this miner mined a correct block. It's got valid data inside of it, and we are all going to include it into our copy of the new chain. And so that's how they achieve consensus, and that's how proof of work works, and that's how they get paid to do this. Now let's look at another consensus mechanism called proof of stake. And this is a very popular one among many smart contract platforms, especially on the new and improved version of Ethereum. So let's look at how that in particular works. So again, you have a user who's paying a gas fee with their wallet to send a transaction to the network, and here's all the nodes in the network. So how do they achieve consensus? So they don't do it through mining, all right? There's no cryptographic puzzles, and there's no miners even, all right? There are nodes on the network, and some of the nodes on the network are responsible for validating transactions before they go into the blockchain. So the miners get replaced by validators in this case, all right? And instead of guessing cryptographic puzzles and competing with one another, all right, they do something called staking. So what they do is they take cryptocurrency, in the case of Ethereum, they take Ether, okay, and they lock it up into a node. So for Ethereum, it's 32 Ether, okay? And then what they do is all the validators on the network, instead of competing with one another, they simply take turns, and the network randomly chooses one validator to verify the validity of transactions as they're getting included into a block. And that validator says, yes, these transactions are valid, or no, they're not valid. And if they are valid, they produce a valid block. And then all the rest of the nodes in the network agree on the validity of that block. Again, that's the consensus aspect. Whenever they add things to the network, everyone else can determine whether their work was honest or not, and whether it was valid. And so if that validator produced a valid block, then they get rewarded with cryptocurrency for doing that by the blockchain. The blockchain creates a block reward, new cryptocurrency that goes to the validator's wallet for creating a valid block. Now, let's talk about staking itself. So whenever they stake their cryptocurrency, here's how the financial incentives come into play. So they've staked 32 Ether to the network, and their incentive is to act honestly and produce accurate, valid blocks that everyone else can agree on, because they'll get paid to do that, all right? And likewise, they will get penalized if they do not produce valid blocks, or their node goes offline for too long or something like that. That's called slashing. So whenever they lock their cryptocurrency up the network, if they act dishonestly and then try to, manipulate the network in any way, or whether it's through a bad actor or just incompetence, then they will lose part of the cryptocurrency that they have staked to the network. And so that's how the final financial incentives come into play to make this consensus protocol work. All right, and then finally, you have delegated proof of stake, which is really just a variant of proof of stake, and this is a very popular one as well. So essentially, it's the same process where you have the same transaction lifecycle, and you have validators in this case, okay, that stake cryptocurrency to the network, and they are rewarded for acting honestly whenever they propose valid blocks to the blockchain, and they're penalized whenever they produce invalid blocks. But instead of the validator only staking their cryptocurrency to the network, you can have somebody else essentially delegate their cryptocurrency to a specific validator. And then that person can take that cryptocurrency and use it to secure the network and run a node. So essentially the idea is, if you have cryptocurrency and you want to stake it, okay, but you don't want to actually run a validator completely, then you can just delegate your stake to somebody else, and then that person can run a node on your behalf. Now, this does introduce a significant amount of trust assumptions to the validator itself, and has lots of other implications on, how the blockchain is going to function from a decentralization standpoint. But delegated proof of stake is a popular consensus mechanism with smart contract platforms. All right, so now I want to go over one more concern that's relevant to consensus before we wrap up this presentation. So that is, security. So again, at the beginning of this lesson, we talked about how can you trust a blockchain to secure all this information, right? You have all these transactions that, construct billions and billions of dollars worth of account balances. How can you just leave that stuff out in the open, shared across a bunch of different computers without any central authority to, make sure that nobody tampers with it? So, that's really what consensus protocols are all about. So, with proof of work, that's what secures the entire chain and nobody can tamper with it. With proof of stake, that's what secures the chain, and so on and so forth. So one of the big features of this is essentially guarding against a 51% attack. Now, this is the threshold that someone would have to control in order to manipulate the network in some way, basically to produce invalid blocks to, compromise the blockchain. And all the major blockchains with their respective security models or consensus models can prevent a 51% attack and are therefore secure. And that's why you can trust all the transactions on the chain. So for example, with Bitcoin, if you were going to produce a 51% attack because it is proof of work, you would have to control 51% or more of the computational power of the entire network. Now, that's an insane amount of computational power because, again, Bitcoin's proof of work. Proof of work requires you to use your computational resources to produce valid blocks and, guess the cryptographic puzzles. So you'd have to have computational resources more advanced than 51% of all the miners on the network. Now, that's going to be insanely hard to do because, each miner individually has an insane amount of computational resources on their own. And even if you could acquire that amount of computational resources, the financial incentives for attacking the network at that point are basically no longer there. So the same is true for other consensus protocols like proof of stake, for example. So on a main blockchain like Ethereum. So if you were to 51% attack a proof of stake blockchain like that, it's not about computational resources anymore. It's about monetary resources. So essentially, you would have to have enough money staked to the network, more than 51% of all the other nodes. And now you're talking billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars at that point. And so there's not going to be a financial incentive to actually manipulate the network in some way. Because if you were able to, change that cryptocurrency, you would change the integrity of the chain, and probably any gain that you would achieve at that point would be completely negated. So the same thing is true for delegated proof of stake, and each, consensus protocol that's actually valid and has gained adoption is going to prevent against a 51% attack in some way and, work against these incentives. All right, so that's an overview of consensus protocols, why they're important for blockchain, and some of the most popular consensus protocols like proof of work, proof of stake, and delegated proof of stake. So that's all I got for this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.